If you have a pronated or flat foot on one or both sides where your arch kind of collapses inward like that, then there are a couple of things that could be leading to this orientation of the foot, but also some consequences that can happen as a result of this orientation. So the number one thing we want to think about first is that we need to be able to access both supination and pronation. In normal gait mechanics, we should strike the ground with our lateral border of our heel, assuming we're just walking. And then we're going to have this diagonal line going through in terms of how we're transferring our weight over the foot, through the midfoot, and then to this metatarsal, and then to the phalange, and we push off in late stance. Now, pronation's a really important part of the gait cycle, but we start in a relatively more supinated state on the lateral border. As we go through mid stance, where our weight is shifted onto that side, we're going to have that pronation, but also that's going to be coupled with dorsiflexion. You can't really have dorsiflexion without pronation, vice versa. So as we get into this pronated state, we are going to stretch out the muscles that are on the bottom of our foot, our intrinsic foot musculature, but also the muscles on this inner aspect, the medial aspect of this foot and heel. So what that's doing is stretching out our supinator muscles, and also the muscles that are going to spring the arch back up so we can propel forward as we push off in late stance. But if we are constantly in a pronated state, if we're constantly down here, then we are always sort of putting this passive stretch on those muscles that should be able to spring back up and allow for supination, which allows for things like hip extension and like knee extension and things like that. But we are going to be unable to stretch those muscles out to the proper extent for their elastic qualities if they're already in a stretch position when we strike the ground. So if we're in this pronated foot position, then we might strike the ground on more of our inner heel. And then we might have a faulty, quote unquote, gait pattern where we just ride that inner border of our foot, and then we're just striking the ground more pronated and then leaving in a less supinated state because we couldn't get the elastic qualities of our foot to work to resupinate the foot so we can push off and then achieve good late stance mechanics. Something else to consider with a pronated foot is that when we are in this early stage of mid stance and we are pronating, what we are actually doing is pushing the most amount in terms of the gait cycle of force into the ground because we have the most amount of force coming up through the floor. So to balance that, we actually have to load our body weight onto that side but push down into the floor. So it's actually a very heavy propulsive stage of gait when we are in that early mid stance and pronating. So because of that push into the floor, what you could kind of mirror that to is if you had one foot that is really pronated in a collapsed arch and you had the other which was more supinated and you had a higher arch on that side. If you had, let's say for example, a heavily pronated left foot but a relatively more supinated right foot, you could be pushing your pelvis forward on the left and then turning your pelvis to the right because you are in more of a propulsive state on the left and more of a load-bearing phase on the right. So what do we do if we have these pronated feet and it's causing us issues? Some people just have a genetic bias towards a pronated foot, and that's going to be okay. If that's not causing you any issues, maybe you don't need to really worry about it. Something we want to consider is biasing ourselves towards more early stance mechanics. What I mean by that is getting us to sense the ability to supinate the foot and also the tibial external rotation, the femoral external rotation, and the pelvic external rotation necessary to get that good supination, because that's what should be happening when we strike the ground. And if you want more information on that, I highly recommend you go check out my Weight Room Training is Gait Training webinar on my YouTube channel. I talk all about how we can bias ourselves towards early stance mechanics, and that should really go a long way for helping restore function within our foot and how that feeds up the chain. But if that doesn't get the job done, I'd highly recommend you go see a physical therapist because sometimes issues can be too complex for just a couple of YouTube videos. So going and seeing someone who really knows what they're doing with the foot can be a really beneficial thing to do.